This demo for OpenAdmin Tool version 3.11 shows how you can configure OAT so that you can log in under your own username to administer the database server. Starting with Informix version 12.10 and OpenAdmin Tool version 3.11, you can now manage SQL admin API privileges for individual users. Individual users can be granted privileges to administer the database server by running SQL admin API commands. Privilege groups identify which SQL admin API commands a user can run and determine which features the user can access in OAT. This functionality frees OAT from the requirement that all users must log in as the user in Informix. Once a certain user has been granted access to a set of SQL admin API privileges, that user can log into OAT using their own user ID. That user can now monitor and administer the Informix database server as themselves. Security is enhanced when all users are using their own user IDs instead of sharing the common Informix account. There are two separate steps in order to utilize this feature in OAT. Step 1. The user in Informix has to log into OAT and grant SQL admin API privileges to individual users. Once logged in as the user in Informix, go to the Server Administration User Privileges link on the menu to manage user privileges on the database server. Use the SQL Admin API Privileges tab to manage user privileges to the SQL Admin API command. This page provides actions to grant, modify, and revoke privileges to the SQL Admin API commands on the database server. In order to allow an individual user to log into OAT, we need to first grant that user access to the admin API commands. In the Grant pop-up, we first specify the username that we want to grant privileges to. Next, use the radio button to set the level of access you want the user to have. Choose the operator privilege group if you want the user to have access to all the SQL admin API commands except the ability to grant and revoke access to the admin API. Choose admin if you want the user to have access to all SQL admin API commands, including the ability to grant and revoke. If you want your user to have full access to OAT, you should either grant operator or admin level privileges. Alternatively, you can grant monitor privileges. This gives access to all read-only commands, so they will only have the ability to run SQL admin API commands that do not make changes on the database server. Lastly, you can choose the custom option in which you can select a custom set of privileges. Basically, you set privileges based on a functionality group. Granting a user access to any of these privilege levels will also automatically grant that user access to the sysadmin database. For our first user, the user Erica, we will grant operator privileges. Now we want to grant access to a second user named Joe. We want to give Joe custom privileges because we want Joe to have access to some SQL admin API commands, but not all of them. We will grant Joe access to the SQL privilege group and the SQL tracing privilege group because we want Joe to be able to run the SQL-based admin API commands, for example, to create a new database, and we want him to be able to manage SQL tracing. But we do not want Joe to run other admin commands, for example, those dealing with storage, backup, or high availability or replication. Now that the user in Informix has granted access to our two individual users, Erica and Joe, we can log out of OAT as Informix. This brings us to step 2. Now that individual users have access to the admin API commands, these users can log into OAT with their own user IDs. First, we'll log in as Erica, who has operator privileges. Recall that since the user Erica has operator level privileges, she can run all the SQL admin API commands except those commands to grant and revoke access to the admin API. So for this demo, let's have the user Erica go to the space administration page and add a new space. You can see that even though I'm logged into OAT as the user Erica, I was able to successfully add a new DB space. Now let's go to the admin command page under the log section of the OAT menu to see what just happened. The admin command page shows all the SQL admin API commands that were run on the database server, including the return message from when the command was run, the time it was run, and the user who ran it. As you can see, the user Erica ran 2 admin API commands against the database server. Those commands were creating a DB space called dbs1 and modifying that space to change the create size and the extend size. Both of those commands get run when you run the create DB space action in OAT. Now let's log out and re-log in as the user Joe. Recall that the user Joe has been granted privileges to the SQL privilege group and the SQL tracing privilege group, but he does not have access to any other SQL admin API commands. It should not be a surprise to you that Joe can do something such as going to the SQL Explorer page and turning on SQL tracing. But what happens if Joe goes to the storage page and tries to drop a space? As you can see, Joe got an error trying to drop a DB space. Let's see why. Any user who tries to run an SQL admin API command that they do not have access to will get an error that they are not authorized to run the command. These commands are still logged and will show up on the admin command page in OAT, so you can see which users tried to run which commands. An important thing to note is that these privileges are being enforced by the database server. OAT is not doing this enforcement itself. OAT allows all users to go to any of its pages, but ultimately the privileges to any action or SQL admin API command will be enforced by the database server. Here's another look at the admin command page so you can see all of the commands that Joe ran. There are a number of commands related to SQL tracing that were run, but you can also see his attempt to run the drop DB space command and the failure message that he was not authorized to run such a command. This concludes our demo. Hopefully you saw how easy it is to grant access to individual users to the SQLadmin API command and how this can benefit you in terms of having those users log into OAT as themselves.